I want to kind of head down the road and get your opinion on this. I was reading something last night about Paul Ryan and the issues he's having with the new way California is dealing with their votes. And he's not calling for an investigation, and he's not accusing anybody of nefarious behavior. He just finds it, and his word is bizarre, that the six hotly contested seats in the House of Representatives decided in the state of California all went to the Democrats. And in 5 of those 6, the Republican was ahead the night of and the morning of the election. And once again, Ryan's doing a backhand, you know what I mean? He's really taking a backhanded stab.
Well, you know, we went on about Florida taking a long time with that close count there. But, you know, it's been a couple of weeks, and I think they've still got one race undecided out in California.
What do you make of that? As somebody who has served on an election commission and has seen up close and personal the nuts and bolts of voting, does that concern you?
Not necessarily, you know, but it is, you know, considering it's this liberal, supposedly kind of clean state. I mean, you know, you wonder why it takes so long in this supposedly progressive, forward-looking, liberal state that the count takes so long. You know, of course, I don't know a lot about what kind of ballot kind of machines they've got out there or what type of vote count systems, but it is curious, sort of. Florida, we don't get too upset about because, you know, they got a long tradition of real close races, and maybe that's what it was out in California. Let me say something on behalf of South Carolina. You know, unlike in a lot of states, we've got an independent state election commission where all the members are appointed by the governor, but you got to have the minority party in state elections has to have representation on there. And, you know, we haven't had many tangles or mess-ups here in South Carolina, and you haven't got a system like they got down in Georgia where the Secretary of State, you know, is the overseer of the state election system. And, you know, we had a mess up down there to the extent they ought to put a law down there. And in a lot of these states where the Secretary of State, you think that thing in Georgia, you know, was untoward, where you had the Republican candidate for governor was the incumbent Secretary of State and counting his own votes.
Makes no sense.
No, and they had one out in Ohio that was even worse, where the Secretary of State was running the election, and he was running for re-election himself, and had an opponent in the Secretary of State's race from the other side, you know, and but we don't have anything like that here in South Carolina.
But how big a problem do you believe voting irregularities are? I mean, if you look at election after election you've been around elections a long time. You served on the state election commission. You've chaired the state election commission, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
You've been around Republican politics a long time. When you hear voter suppression or multiple votings, and how big a problem do you think we have with what I'll label voting irregularity?
It's better now than it once was. You know, here in South Carolina, it's far better. You know, a lot of people don't know it, but before the State Election Commission was formed, the State Board of Canvassers, this is back when the Democrats controlled everything, the State Board of Canvassers were the statewide constitutionally elected officers. And, you know, at one time here in South Carolina, the state Democratic Party's ballots in primaries were paid for by the state. Okay? The Republicans had to get their own money, raise their own money, and print their own ballots. You know, we've got a first-rate state election commission and voting system here in South Carolina. And we don't see many irregularities.
Is there a significant election that you can remember in your political observations that may have been affected? I mean, we hear the Nixon, Kennedy election in Texas and Illinois, I think, were the two states that there was a lot of questions. Now the Kennedy folks will say that's just conspiracy theorists and paranoia running amok. The Nixon side will say, no, there were voting irregularities. You stuffed the ballot box. You did things that were out of sorts. Is there an election that the majority of our listeners would be familiar with?
That here in South Carolina,
well, I mean,
or nationally?
Yeah, no, that you really have always questioned the legitimacy of the outcome.
Well, for me, you got to go back to the Kennedy-Nixon race, particularly in Illinois and Texas, where, there was an old seer named, what was that lady's name? I can't remember, and they always said she had Republican proclivities, Jean Dixon. So she goes on television and she said, I have it, from the crystal ball and whatever, Nixon's going to win. And after the election, when Jack Kennedy wins the thing, she goes back on the same television show and somebody said, well, you said Nixon was going to win and he didn't. And she said, oh, but he did. But South Carolina, for example, this fella from down at the beach, thinks he knows a great deal about
Alan Clemens.
Alan Clemens.
He's a House member.
Yeah. And that guy doesn't know his tail from 20 cents, about elections here in the state. And he gets this thing, photo ID through the General Assembly. In other words, that's just cut down on impersonation. Let me tell you, talk about a statute that was chasing something that didn't really exist. I as a chairman of the state election commission here in Sa- and on the board for 16 years, I sat on a lot of cases of contested general elections. And there would be small irregularities. I mean, you just can't say, oh, well, somebody was standing inside the 100-foot mark passing literature and all this kind of thing. But what you have to say is, how many votes did that affect? In other words, the irregularities that can clearly shown have to cast the outcome in doubt.
And you've never seen that in South Carolina?
Oh, sure. We overturned a few elections, very few, and made them run it again. But on impersonation, not one.
Gotcha.
And I sat on probably 80 to 90 cases up there, but of Democrats versus Republicans in general elections. Not one did impersonation play any kind of role in tainted ballots. Now, you get people who would vote in the wrong precinct, whether it was intentional or not. Usually,
why do we need precincts?
Well, you've got to organize the election in some fashion so you can manage it.
So you know what to expect as it relates to turnout. The manpower necessary to handle the number of votes.
Well, it gives the political scientists
sure. You've always enjoyed. It amazes me, and Rev, I think, is as interested in the way you talk about precincts in Pennsylvania and precincts in the lower part of Florida. And, box is what you always refer to them as the boxes.
That's what they always call them here in South Carolina.
The boxes hadn't come in from Greenville.
But boxes, meant that in the old days. I'll tell you, when we first ran the first Republican statewide primary in 1974, and see, the parties had to pay for them in those days. Now, the state pays for them. But I remember, you know, the Republicans, we actually had more volunteers and, you know, than the Democratic side did. But I remember in 74, I sat over at Sardis, you know, for 3 votes that were cast in the Republican gubernatorial and lieutenant gubernatorial primary. And the box was a shoebox, you know, because we didn't have the money. You know, the Democrats had the boxes and controlled all the county election commissions and all this kind of thing.
That's interesting.
So things have dramatically improved. Now, you know, I think we've still got a problem. Most counties in South Carolina now have the mechanic. I mean, not mechanical. That's the old time of
the computerized.
They have computerized voting, touch screens, and you know, I think as a safeguard, there ought to be some sort of paper printout to show an individual
to create a paper trail.
You know, to create a paper trail, because with these touchscreen voting, you don't have any kind of paper trail. And people say, well, we're going to get a recount. But, you know, all they do with a recount with those touchscreens is to go back and run the cartridges again, and it comes. The only place there's any possibility of picking up some votes is with absentee ballots.
Correct.
That are mailed in.
We got to take a break. We'll be back after the break. Thanks to Gillespie's Peanuts. Takes Mondays to make Fridays. Good morning, PD, Live 95.